Hi, welcome to the first real module of our course. I'm Tucker Balch, and this is Computational Investing Part 1. I'm going to open this module by talking about how I'm approaching the class. I'm assuming that you want to be a portfolio manager, and I know it might not be the case that everybody who's listening wants to be a portfolio manager, but it provides a point of view for the class and a motivation for choosing to do things one way or another. So that's the approach we're taking. Now, the objectives for this module are one, to, like I said, understand the viewpoint of the class, but also kind of get inside the head a little bit of a portfolio manager. What are their incentives? What are the types of portfolios or funds that a portfolio manager might manage? And how are they assessed? How do we know if a portfolio manager is doing well or not well? Because that'll also help us shape what we want to do with the course. Okay, so here's a picture of a portfolio manager. Obviously, it's a very computing-centric business, and as you can see in that photo, this portfolio manager is using a lot of computation in what he does. Okay, what does it mean to be a portfolio manager? Well, one way to think about it is, what are the incentives for a portfolio manager? So let's look at that. The incentives are primarily set by how does he get paid, he or she. And there are a couple primary ways that we look at this way that they're paid. One is strictly called an expense ratio, and this is the way many mutual funds and electronically traded funds, the way those who manage them are compensated. And it's just a fixed percentage of the whole fund, typically 1%, usually less than 1%, sometimes as high as 2%. And that's of all the funds that are managed. So, for example, if they're managing a $1 billion fund, the compensation is $10 million per year, 1% per year. Now that has to cover all the expenses of running the fund, and sometimes running funds are quite expensive. The standard hedge fund compensation is what's called 2 and 20. So it's 2% of the total assets under management plus 20% of profits. Now, there's a big difference between these two examples. One thing, let's consider this particular example. If you're managing, say, a $1 million fund and it makes 20% in a year, that means the total compensation for the management firm is $60,000 a year. If you multiply that, say, by 100, then you're looking at $6 million per year. Now, these two approaches are quite different and provide different incentives for the different sorts of managers. For instance, if you are someone who's managing a mutual fund or an ETF, your main goal is to attract investment because you're just getting this constant 1%. If you are a hedge fund manager, you can see that you have this significant incentive to make total returns each year, and that can become the major component of compensation. So anyways, when you're thinking about how to manage a fund or what the incentives are, these are the two prevalent mechanisms. Okay, so let's suppose now you've decided you want to be a hedge fund manager. How are you going to attract investment? In other words, in order for you to make money, you've got to be managing a fund, and you've got to have folks invest in your fund. Well, an important first step there is to think about who is going to invest. There are, of course, individual investors. That's, let me go back. So, for example, a rich or wealthy individual might invest in your hedge fund. That's actually probably the smallest component of folks who invest in hedge funds. By far the largest are institutional investors. And these are folks, for instance, like the Harvard Foundation or the Georgia Tech Foundation or large retirement plans who have potentially billions of dollars that they manage. They look to invest some of their funds in hedge funds. And it's important to understand how they choose which hedge funds to invest in. It's not just that they're looking for the highest return. There are other factors as well, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. One final source of investing are funds of funds, and these are hedge funds themselves, but they collect investment from individual investors, also institutions, but then they look at multiple individual hedge funds and they figure out how to allocate to each hedge fund individually. Okay, those are the potential investors. Now let's look at some other aspects. Now that we know what our particular audience is, how do we convince them to invest in our fund? One way, and I have to choose the pen here, one way is to have a great track record. So if you've been managing a fund and it's been performing well, of course, it's easy to get more money to continue to invest well. Often hedge funds are started by people who work at a large investment bank or a hedge fund, and then they spin off into a separate fund that they manage themselves, and so they bring a track record with them. Not everybody has that ability to have a track record and start a new fund. So another way to do it is to develop your own theory about investing or strategy, and then simulate your strategy and have compelling simulation results, and those are called back tests. Now that's tricky because having a back test that people believe is a challenge. People really want to see funds already invested, but still it's the case that many people, they just have a theory and they have a back test and they use that to get going. One final aspect that's important, especially for institutional investors, is institutional investors, they look at risk and they want to diversify to reduce risk, and that, of course, is a topic for the course. But they do this by investing in several different kinds of investments, like large U.S. stocks, precious metals, energy sector stocks. And they want to, in the same way, they want to be able to classify your fund so that they can think about the big picture. They can think, okay, this guy manages my large cap Dow stocks, and so he's got that component of his overall portfolio figured out, and he's got somebody managing that, and then he's got other aspects invested in other hedge funds. This pigeonhole thing, though, what's kind of tricky about that is you have to convince the people who are investing that you are in that pigeonhole, that you are in that classification, and we'll talk a little bit more about that too. Okay, so we've thought a little bit about who might invest, what the incentives for a hedge fund manager are, and how to convince them that you're building a good approach. Well, what are the things that they want to see specifically? In other words, when they look at your track record or your back test, what are they looking for? And the answer to that question depends partly on what kind of a hedge fund you are. Remember, I mentioned this pigeonhole idea. Well, in order for them to be able to classify you and assess you and judge you and compare your portfolio versus a similar other portfolio, you need a benchmark. You need to show, for instance, if you're going to be the large cap hedge fund, you need to compare yourself against large cap stocks and show that you're performing as well as, or hopefully better than some other portfolio. So you need a benchmark, And a benchmark is essentially, it's usually a big index like the Dow Jones or the S&P 500. And the goal is to compare the funds you manage to this benchmark. And there's a number of performance metrics we can do, and we can see whether that the fund is better than the benchmark or not. The other type of fund and another type of goal is absolute return. So we don't essentially we don't ever want to lose money. We don't care how we do compared to a benchmark. We just always want positive returns. Obviously, that's very hard to achieve. We'll see a little bit later why it's hard to achieve. But in that case, in the case of an absolute return fund, folks are usually looking, of course, for positive return, but they're usually willing to accept a slightly lower overall return, but also with lower risk. So you have to have both of those, or those usually come together in an absolute return fund. In the benchmark fund, you want to do better than the benchmark. Okay, so how do we compare how you're doing versus the benchmark? That's the topic of the next lecture. So we'll close now and go on to the next video. Thanks very much.